Venat is one of the most polarizing characters in Final Fantasy XIV. She's given several different motivations, from mankind needing to accept suffering to know happiness, to needing to be less etherically dense to interact with Dynamis, to needing to close a time loop, which are contradictory under scrutiny. The latter two undermine the moral explanation for her actions if the sundering was always necessary. The final one creates a paradox, and while Alexander is a similar situation, it is self-contained. In Endwalker, it's not only the foundation of the lore as a whole, but a fundamental part of both the current and future setting. Read nearly any discussion about Venat, and you'll see people posit different reasons they've interpreted as the real explanation. Of the two major events that have occurred in Etheirys' history, she chose non-intervention during the first, and was directly responsible for the second, despite having foreknowledge of their devastation. Even if you believe her justified, characters responsible for the amount of harm she's caused aren't put on a pedestal in 14, so she stands out as an anomaly. When a writer chooses to insist a character is objectively righteous, if there are people they can't bring on board with that outlook, it causes dissonance. The mind is repulsed by any disparity between what it is being told is true and what it knows to be true. People tend to have a disproportionately negative response to controversial elements that offer no room within the media for disagreement, and the text treats Venat with unambiguous positivity despite the gray nature of her actions. It feels like the writers are demanding you abandon your values and accept theirs, or else become an unwanted player for whom the game isn't for. So why didn't this character land with everyone, when she's clearly meant to be the star of the show? Let's start with the reasons for the sundering, as established in the Lore Q&A live letter. Venat believed the Ancients, being so dense in ether, could not control Dynamis, and thus could not have stopped the final days at its source. She also believed the Ancients were unable to change as a people, and the Plenty section of the Dead End's dungeon is cited as the writer's vision of what probably would have happened if the Ancients had continued as they were. We'll begin with Dynamis. The primary issue with Dynamis compared to Ether is we understand the latter fairly well, having dealt with it extensively, while Dynamis is introduced at the 11th hour, is critical to the plot, and lacks any rules or clear display of what it even is or does. First and foremost, it's imperative we clear up the misconception that the Ancients were wholly incapable of interacting with Dynamis, as this is factually incorrect.
Reflect the emotional state, you say? By what means do they achieve this?
In creation, there exists an energy wholly apart from ether, one driven by emotions. In like manner to how we manipulate ether, this flower is subject to the influence of said energy.
Hermes later says the Ancients cannot readily manipulate Dynamis due to their etheric concentration, not that it's impossible for them to do so. Dynamis is an energy put in motion by feelings. His ability to change the color of the Elpis flowers is proof they could interact with Dynamis. As the Warrior of Light demonstrates, it takes being in close proximity to the blossoms and a focus on intense emotion to change their color, otherwise they react to the prevailing emotion in the vicinity. This is shown to still be the case for the Sundered when we're introduced to the heart blooms in Labyrinthos. Plus, if the Elpis flower, an entelechy, is the basis for determining interaction with Dynamis, then Median could also be taken as evidence, since she reacts to the intense feelings of those around her. Additionally, with Endsinger's implication that the Warrior of Light's use of Limit Break 3 during the phase transition of her fight as Dynamis, then Emet-Selch, Hythlodaeus, and Venat could all Limit Break, as shown in Ktisis Hyperboreia, with Elidibus and Seed of Sacrifice being capable of Limit Break 4. Second, given the existence of Medion, the Ancients were capable of creating beings that could manipulate Dynamis. Hythlodaeus comments, "'Tis a shame there is no registered concept we could use to create another Medion, assuming of course we could link her to the shared mind, so there were possibilities that weren't explored. There are many speculative options. Something akin to Ktisis Hyperboreia's field of dampening could have been used to suppress their creation magics, which was their only vulnerability to the Song of Oblivion. Pandemonium introduced the potential of self-sundering, as well as the concept of the Hemitheos, a project focused on melding with creations, which could theoretically include an entelechy. The ability to become primals who could traverse the stars such as Shinryu, not to mention, how did we get to Ultima Thule? An astronomical amount of ether, with ancient-made familiars that were capable of building and piloting spaceships. It comes across as a contrivance that the problem is completely unsolvable to them, since Medion is an ancient creation. Hermes said it was an esoteric field, not that he was the only scholar. The final days would have necessitated research devoted to Dynamis, and they had a minimum of 12,000 years of safety provided by an unsundered zodiac shield in which to devise a solution. Venat considered Dynamis important enough to be half of her reasoning for decimating the ancients, and yet the Sundered are no more adept in or knowledgeable about it than the ancients were. The botanist in Labyrinthos tells us, even with the collected wisdom of Charlian at our disposal, we've yet to identify the underlying principle of this empathic effect, and Nidhana's words echo Hermes before we even meet him.
Akasha can neither be created nor destroyed. It is beyond our power to purposefully alter or manipulate. But even for us, Akasha is a somewhat abstract field of study. A lack of practical application lends itself poorly to formalized research.
Consider what the Sundering did to mankind in terms of Dynamis. The Sundered are significantly more susceptible to the final days, not only in terms of becoming blasphemies, but in causing chain reactions. Medion comments in Ultima Thule that the Sundered are easily unmade, and the Scions are only returned at the end through the use of ancient magics. The short story, A Question of Life, also indicates being too susceptible to Dynamis is dangerous. Medion rose to her feet and dutifully delivered the report in her halting voice. Her sister had been caught in a raging torrent of Dynamis, she explained, and subsequently unmade, like so many others before. As a being of Dynamis, Medion could survive in most any environment by reducing her constituent ether to a bare minimum, yet by the same token, being made of Dynamis rendered Medion vulnerable to its influence. Though its potential was suppressed on ether-rich Aetheris, it behaved in unexpected ways in the void beyond, ways that confused and confounded her. Then there's the problem with Dynamis philosophically, when half of the reason for the eradication of the ancients is based on inherent characteristics, essentially saying as a race of people, they were fundamentally wrong, biologically inadequate, and in need of non-consensual fixing at the behest of someone else's judgment. The suggestion of the way they were born was innately inferior, and using that as a means of justifying their extinction in favor of a superior mankind, based in part on Venat's interactions with one person who is exceptional among the Sundered, becomes deeply concerning, as the Sundering then becomes about eugenics. This is a plot element in the Endwalker Sage quests. The antagonist seeks to forcefully alter mankind, to evolve, and yet he is opposed in the strictest terms and treated as a villain. Addendum as of 6.4. This is also precisely what Athena, the villainess of the Pandemonium raids, sought to do. She says, "My theory was that any true god would see us as we are, imperfect. She would hammer out our flaws and build something greater. To prove this could not but benefit the star, I would give it the perfect stewards, that it might shine brighter than any other." To which Eric replies, "And you would destroy the lives already upon it." More on their parallels later. There was also an element of social Darwinism within 6.0 that Ishikawa had to walk back in Omega Beyond the Rift, which incidentally unraveled part of Venat's motives. Venat wished for mankind to develop a means to overcome despair, believing that by sundering all of creation, mankind had the potential to see it fulfilled by accepting suffering as their constant companion. However, in Thavnir, this idea is rejected. Omega concludes succumbing to the Song of Oblivion is arbitrary, illogical, and based on individual perspective, which couldn't be attributed to one's fortitude, strength, or composition, as well as the premise of someone having a greater ability against despair being wrong to begin with. Putting aside everything I've outlined, there's one crucial sticking point as to whether or not Dynamis was truly a factor in the ability to overcome Medion, and that is, if the ancients had changed, had forged ahead to Venat's satisfaction, would she have sundered them? Because if the answer is yes, then all of her outreach was merely a ruse. Endwalker is an expansion that extols the idea of never giving up hope. In Ultima Thule, the Scions attempt to answer in their sacrifices that there could have been a way for the fallen civilizations to live on and find purpose. It's only the ancients who are deemed beyond salvation, to the extent that by the end of the Omicron quests, even the Nibiru, the very beings the ancients were implied to emulate, are open to reassessing themselves. Final Fantasy XIV as a game puts forth the idea that as long as you don't give up, you can atone. Aside from my personal belief that even if the ancients were about to go down the wrong path, they still had the right to do so, at their worst, they could have had better days ahead of them, just like every other society we see. Venat being so stricken by a distant possibility of a stagnant future, to the extent of annihilating every ancient, felt strangely out of place in conjunction with the rest of the messaging of Endwalker, which generally came down to, we know all things will end, but we will continue to live and make the most of the time we have. Y'shtola's statements to the Ia in particular could easily be applied to Venat.
While I appreciate your advice, I will not heed it. Convinced though you may be of this truth, it is yours and not mine. Indeed, truth, I have ever believed, is in the eye of the beholder. The universe may end, and all may be for naught, but I will live as I always have.
Y'shtola's response is framed as heroic, but for the ancients it would be considered misguided and used as a basis for their end. The ancients' right to self-determination supersedes Venat's opinion on their worthiness to live. The only one to decide the plenty was the ancients' assured fate was Venat, based off of 2 lines of a report from a hostile entity with no further context. It's curious that this particular world concerned her so greatly. The ones that did not collapse due to perfection, that fell to war, conquest, and disease, don't deter her from proceeding to reduce Etheirys to such a state it becomes vulnerable to a myriad of dead ends it wasn't at risk for previously. Even avoiding the plenty was never something that could be done permanently. The Allegan Empire during the Third Era began to experience stagnation and complacency in a similar post-scarcity society, ultimately falling to Emperor Xandi's nihilism. It's exactly what Venat set out to stop from happening to the ancients, but the Sundered reached the same point. The Nibiru's pursuit of happiness over all else, in tandem with Cooking Way's dialogue, are direct in implying minimizing suffering will lead to an empty life. It's a cultural trope based on misunderstandings of societal decay, that comfort inevitably leads to apathy, but it's not reflective of any nuanced understanding of real-world history or psychology. The writers invented a fantastical basis where, within the logic of their universe, the extermination of the ancients was justified based on this sociological theory. It also doesn't allow players to engage critically with the claim that suffering is essential to experience joy and to build resilience, both of which are controversial notions, which the narrative does very little to argue so much as preach. However, let's get down to brass tack comparisons. The Nibiru were focused on the self, making their lives as easy and idyllic as possible, not the balance or betterment of the star. They appear to live above the shattered remains of their home. They began as mortal and sought a way to excise themselves from the life cycle by becoming immortal, eventually becoming a hive mind, the Harmony. Contrast with the ancients, who have a seat on the convocation for the purpose of mediation. Debate as a society was encouraged and enjoyed, as we see with the Firebrand in Amarat. There's also a seat for the arts. Emet-Selch was an ardent admirer and patron of the arts, indicating they had passions outside of their duties. They were also researching the universe, and while the Nibiru expressed interest in doing so, they seemed to lack the motivation to follow through. The ancients also don't see themselves as above the life cycle, but as part of it, with returning to the star being a core tenet of their beliefs and viewed as beautiful. They were not naive about the threat of stagnancy as shown in the Community Cohesion side quest in Amarat, and are shown to find joy in discovering different perspectives, with a willingness to take the viewpoints of others into consideration, as we see in the Elpis side quests. There were ancients capable of introspection, a sentiment we see reflected throughout our interactions with them. They were also not a hive mind. This is evident in the conflict surrounding the third sacrifice, which caused a rift within their society. Their culture could have adjusted and adapted had they been informed of the truth by Venat. Presenting a scenario where the only solution was to functionally kill them all and expunge their culture and history seems extreme to say the least. Singling out the ancients and putting aside the many ways in which they are not similar to the Nibiru other than dress code starts to feel targeted if not mean-spirited. Anything other than deference to Venat's perspective is presented as immature, despite the fact that the ancients' longing for their civilization to be restored was understandable, perhaps all the more relatable after the pandemic. It also pushes a dubious moral that people who don't suffer enough are doomed to become apathetically suicidal or morally deviant and thus need to be forced into it for their own good. The writers tried to alter the ancients to fit a mold for their themes that doesn't work because it's not what they are. They're not Yulmore. They're never shown to be complacent, fixated on the pursuit of pleasure to the detriment of all else, or bereft of difficulty in their lives. Even in a creation testing facility, where you'd expect to find the least amount of compassion, they still display empathy. Their defining trait is selflessness. It's why Alphino was stunned into silence when Emmet asked if half the Sundered would sacrifice themselves to save the other, because he knew they wouldn't. Then, in a swift reversal, it's implied the ancients were doomed due to a contrived unwillingness to change, an argument that falls flat as we're shown through Elpis' side quests that change is possible. We sow the seeds of it ourselves. Ancients are enthusiastic to amend their last rites traditions based on our suggestion, and they're introduced to the possibility of familiars having the potential to gain a soul. The capacity was there, it's that neither Venat or Hermes, for that matter, were willing to put in the effort to enact that change, other than by destructive force. Even if we assume the ancients' culture is somehow incapable of change within the 12,000 years of guaranteed protection they had under Zodiarc's barrier, does it justify the unilateral destruction of every life on the star? The premise of Endwalker is that all civilizations in the cosmos will eventually die, including Aetheris, even without Medion around to cause it. Is sundered civilization inherently better than another several millennia of unsundered civilization? Is the Plenty a worse fate than the one it'll eventually have? Given a universe in which entropy will ultimately triumph, what qualifies as a failed or successful world? Endwalker didn't confront these themes with enough introspection. Venat begins by saying, "We cannot allow the report that set this calamity in motion to become common knowledge. Were the masses to learn of the fates of the other stars, I fear the situation would spiral out of our control." Yet earlier at Ktisis she says, "Bleak as the contents of Medion's report might be, many could hear it and remain content with their lives. So which is it?" Her shift comes across as a matter of convenience. Regardless, there's no reason for everyone to know the minutiae of the situation, only the basics. However, I would think it'd be easier to process knowing the final days were the result of a rogue creation using Dynamis. Instead, they were left to deal with the panic and chaos caused by creation magics running amok for unknown reasons, spawning terminus beasts which slaughtered them in the streets. Hermes' involvement being the reason Venat couldn't call upon the 14 was illogical for several reasons. He has no cause to turn against everyone. Due to his memory erasure, he wouldn't remember the report Medion gave about the dead ends. He should be no more hesitant to volunteer his knowledge than he was in Elpis. He didn't erase his memories of researching Dynamis or creating entelechies. Were shown both in Elpis and Pandemonium, the echo can be used to view memories of people or places, which could have been used to learn everything he knew. He's no match for the Convocation. Should all else fail, they'd be well within their authority to coerce him into cooperating.
Where to begin? The end. Your understanding of what caused the final days is consistent with our own.
His supposed expertise of Dynamis wasn't a factor in the final days. In fact, he wasn't even able to identify it as the source. We knew everything the Convocation did before we even journeyed to Elpis, and Emmet later tells us, according to your story, the 14 divined the connection between the celestial currents and the final days, but were never able to pinpoint the root cause of the calamity. With our people's greatest minds, not to mention Hythlodaeus' sharp eyes, committed to the pursuit of a solution, such an outcome seems inconceivable. The only possible explanation is if the nature of the catalyst was so inexplicable that even we failed to perceive it. Hermes is only ever credited with discovering the decay took root where the celestial currents were weakest. By the end of Elpis, Venat knew more about the final days than Hermes ever brought to the table as Van Daniel, and could have shared that information with the Convocation without him ever knowing. Bearing in mind, while the Convocation was racing to identify the problem and devise a solution, the entire world outside of Amarat was being destroyed. Asking us to believe Hermes was somehow so indispensable it was better to allow billions to die rather than risk upsetting him is highly questionable ethically. There's also no rationale presented as to why Venat couldn't say anything after Zodiark was summoned and the final days forestalled. Even if he had been crucial to their success, at that point it had been achieved and he is irrelevant. Yet Venat maintained her secrecy and did not warn anyone of the true threat intent on their destruction. Because Venat ultimately agrees to the terms and conditions of Hermes' challenge, that mankind's right to live is not a given, but something that must be proven, despite the fact the Warrior of Light already told them both the devastating results. Having the protagonist pander to the whims of the antagonist and willingly debilitate their own cause for the sake of fairness was unscrupulous. Her priority isn't preventing senseless death, it's winning the philosophical argument against Medion. This way of thinking isn't practical, it's abstract and ideological. The irony is, Hermes has a line of dialogue where he says, "Before we seal their fates, we owe it to these beings to exhaust all options to ensure that nothing has been overlooked." This same care wasn't extended to the ancients by Venat at all. I don't know who needs to hear this, but this scene is not an accurate depiction of events. It conflicts with all other lore, ranging from Kitana Rabble to Hythlodaeus' Shade in Amarat, to the Anamnesis and NieR cutscene in Shadowbringers, to the Erar Curtain Falls short story, to Hydaelyn's own dialogue after the Mother Crystal in Endwalker. I have seen people refer to this cutscene as being literal, and I feel it's important to clarify that it is not. The sundering occurred as a result of Hydaelyn's decisive blow against Zodiark being so strong it sundered both him and the star. This is stated by both Emet-Selch and Hydaelyn herself.
And so they fought, and they fought, and they fought, and in the end, Hydaelyn was victorious. With all her strength, she smote him, dealing a blow so devastating that it split the very fabric of reality. As a counterbalance to Zodiark, Hydaelyn was created with the power to enervate her foe. This singular ability strikes not at such banal things as flesh, but everything that defines the target, diluting its existence. Do you see? This self-same fate befell not only Zodiark, but the very star.
When confronted with the almighty Zodiark, my only recourse was rend him and the world asunder, that his power be diminished for a time.
Venat's transformation into Hydaelyn transpires after her disciples reach a consensus, following a meeting one of them had with the Convocation that did not achieve their desired result. The precursor to her ritual is shown in the recording at Anamnesis and NieR, corroborated by the short story A Friendship of Record, and further remarked upon by the Watcher in Omega Beyond the Rift, It was not something she did by herself in the street. It's stated in Ere Our Curtain Falls, the people were divided, unable to decide what to do with the future that now stretched out before them. All were at our wits' end.
Reconciliation. Elidibus. I was needed. I withdrew myself from Zodiark. For them.
Elidibus is nowhere in sight, nor are any other Convocation members. It's 15 random, nameless ancients in a plaza who by all appearances seem to be trying to sacrifice themselves, as there's no new life to be seen either. Their argument also doesn't match with previous discussions of the third sacrifice. Per Ere Our Curtain Falls, many wished to trade the new life which had sprung forth to reclaim those lost in sacrifice to Zodiark. Per Hythlodaeus in Mare Lamentorium, we remember in vivid detail the events leading to our purgatory, the plans and plots for our resurrection. Per his shade in Amarat created by Emet-Selch, the Convocation decided thus: we would nurture our world until it was bursting with vitality. Then, when the time was right, we could offer some portion of its living energy to Zodiark. In return, he would restore to us those brethren whose souls had fed his strength, and together we would resume our roles as stewards. The aim of the third sacrifice, as formulated by the Convocation after the world was restored, was to release the souls within Zodiark, but there's no mention of this in the cutscene, only vagaries of a perfect paradise free of sorrow. The sky is aflame, the streets are littered with the corpses of ancients felled by terminus beasts, the city lies in ruins, and Therion can be seen flying in the background. There's no evidence of the first sacrifice having halted the final days, or the second sacrifice having cleansed and restored life to the world, yet the scene is supposed to be referencing the third sacrifice. It brings into question whether her infamous monologue happened in any capacity. Perhaps, henceforth he shall walk, was Hydaelyn's battle cry against Zodiark? I struggle with what to call the so-called Sundering cutscene. Symbolic, metaphorical, abridged, stylistic retelling. While it's loosely representative in an inspired by true events sort of way, it's presented with bias while removing anything that could lead to negative impressions of Venat or her actions. Imagine someone telling a story and leaving out anything that would make them look bad. It's dishonest and deliberately manipulative. Amusingly, it meets the definition of disinformation, since it's purposely misleading and intended to both influence public opinion and obscure the truth. It's a carefully crafted appeal to emotion, meant to rationalize a violent act, with the focus being on Venat's perspective, how much the Sundering was hurting her, and the people she decimated used as staging for her noble torment. Simply changing the background music from answers to what comes of despair significantly alters the tone of the scene, as well as your perception of Venat and what she's about to do.
You would destroy it? Our beautiful world?
The reliance on Venat's opposition being faceless straw men could also be considered cowardly, since the sequence would fall apart if they were replaced with any developed ancient character. Try to imagine Emet-Selch or Elidibus debating Venat in that scene instead of a caricature. Elidibus being particularly problematic because we'd then be reminded there were no small number who were in opposition to the third sacrifice, which would undermine Venat's argument that the ancients as a whole were incapable of change, and we wouldn't have gotten the powerful imagery of her standing alone against a mob. Had the scene not been disingenuous, I would comment on how tone-deaf it was to have her approach grief-stricken and traumatized survivors of an extinction-level event, tell them to essentially forge ahead and abandon the souls of their loved ones within Zodiark indefinitely, especially when Venat's not shown to have taken any measures to help mitigate the destruction wrought by the final days. It's a reminder of how easy it is to get swept up in a narrative, to fall to victim blaming, and convince yourself that massacring a population is a necessary evil as long as you're suitably distracted by beautiful music, symbolism, and a charismatic person. The Sundering is presented in more detail in the Final Fantasy XIV crossover with NieR Reincarnation. NieR producer Yosuke Saito said Ishikawa was given full freedom to write the story.
Pitiful moaning of malformed creatures. They can no longer shape words. Language, culture, knowledge, forgotten.
Malformed creatures thrashing blindly about. Pitiful, disturbing, depressing.
This sentiment is repeated yet again in the quote from Emmett's memory crystal, which reads, "Gone is the brilliant radiance of life, replaced by the sickly glow of malformed creatures." Contrast this with how his gifted vision sees the world unsundered as described in the short story through his eyes. What he beheld was the ether that comprised all things, radiating life. From the depths of the land to the heights of the firmament, its light shone bright. The Sundering didn't create life, it defiled it in a way Venat's brethren likely would have considered unconscionable. People assume the Sundering made less etherically dense carbon copies of everyone based on Emmett's demonstration with Rean and the Ocular. However, this couldn't be the case because the Sundered races are the reincarnations of the Ancients who aren't identical to them, and it was confirmed in the lore Q&A after the Sundering mankind was incomplete and had to evolve into the races we know of today, as NieR depicts. The Sundered are also small in size compared to the Ancients to reflect their diminished state. Had Emmett shown the true effects of the Sundering, the copy of Rean he made as an example should have been half the height of the original. The fact Emmett cannot understand the newly Sundered with the Echo indicates it's not merely the loss of language, but loss of intellect. You can't turn on the soul's auto-translate if there's nothing to translate. Language requires knowledge. Even Kryle's Echo, sensitive as it is, doesn't allow her to understand animals, suggesting the Sundered had effectively been reduced to a similar state. This is also supported by the lost little troll quest in Labyrinthos. Shaggles is said to possess remarkable intelligence, with him saying due to our Echo, we can understand his general sentiments, despite him being physically incapable of speech. Emmett says in addition to the soul, all aspects are reduced. The full Sundering, 1/14, would have left people with approximately 7% of their original attributes, a substantial de-evolution. Assuming mankind was degraded to physical and mental infancy in terms of development, combined with the Encyclopedia Eorzea Volume 1 suggesting early humanity was scattered tribes, despite the surviving ancients living in the metropolis of Amarot, large-scale death becomes implicit. As it says in NieR, in the simplest ways, they die and die. It brings to mind the Oregon Trail video game, where the manners of death included, but were not limited to, inclement weather, animal attacks, starvation, illness, and injuries. According to the wiki, the first astral era is thought of as the dawn of mankind, and considered to be a time of primitivity when the only goal was to survive. No written history exists, but historians have recovered stone tools and cave paintings from the time, which could explain Kitana Ravel, since anthropologists believe painting predates complex speech. Continued in the NieR narration, it's centuries before they speak in new tongues, worship new gods, and they can barely comprehend magic. It's not until the second umbral era that the first forms of magic are believed to have been born from human prayers.
And the worst part? No one could remember it. Not really. Just fragments and fleeting memories of an achingly familiar world.
Putting aside the revelations from NieR, Final Fantasy XIV is a setting in which identity being treated as personhood is regularly established. Loss of identity equals death. Souls cleansed in the ethereal sea and reincarnated are, for all intents and purposes, new people. This is addressed in both Rean and Gaia's arcs in Shadowbringers. It's also true for rejoinings. The souls of the Shard merge with their counterpart on the Source, yet the story doesn't shy away from calling it murder. This leaves us with two ways to interpret what we know that isn't internally contradictory. We either acknowledge we cannot apply a real-world definition of death to the setting and accept that, within the internal logic of the game, loss of identity is equivalent to death, meaning the Sundering was murder, or we conclude nobody truly dies in this universe outside of the rare case of soul destruction, noting the latter is not the perspective the game has historically taken. Regardless of your interpretation, the Sundering identity death, or worse, every living being on the star. It wasn't only the people who were in favor of the third sacrifice, but those who didn't agree with it and anyone not involved in the decision-making process, such as children. It also wasn't only the adamant souls of the ancients, there was implicit collateral damage. A loss of this nature is also something Alphino vehemently opposed in Shadowbringers, saying, "But what value is there in surviving when all our history, all our struggles will be erased? I cannot conscience such an act."
No, I didn't hear anything, but... Why do I feel so... like I've lost something dear to me?
Alice later says, "The star shower didn't awaken me to Heidelin's voice, but that vision of the final days, of Amarat burning, it filled me with sadness to the very pit of my being. Things I once knew, people I once loved, promises I once made. It felt as though long-forgotten memories were dancing at the edges of my mind, but when I try to focus on them, they simply fade away, an effect of having a fractured soul, I shouldn't doubt. Yet no one has any words for Heidelin. What she took from mankind, a loss that is persistent through the memory of the soul and its shards, cannot and should not be understated. This idea that the perpetuation of life mattered more than the welfare of the life that existed doesn't engage with any counter-arguments either. Her admission there was no kindness nor justice in the tragedy I wrought does not absolve her, especially when she expresses no regret and only cares that the Warrior of Light was able to surpass her. Speaking of whom, the Warrior of Light was 9/14, or roughly 64% rejoined at the time of both meeting Venat and defeating Endsinger, sundering the world into 14 parts, when 2 should have suitably met the threshold for Dynamis, would seem excessive in retrospect. The Watcher tells us after Zodiark's defeat, he believes Heidelin did not wish to speak of Atheris and her history, and later, in Omega Beyond the Rift, mentions his memories being cut away, and that as a creation of hers, he believed the age of the ancients would be forgotten. This is also corroborated by Elidibus in Shadowbringer's epilogue, where he says, "The origins of the world remain hidden, and its inhabitants ignorant of their broken existence, just as she desired." It's possible a one-half split may have been insufficient damage to selfhood to ensure that level of memory loss, and the subsequent erasure of the ancients' culture, history, and even existence as a race. During Pandemonium, La Habrea comments multiple times on the Warrior of Light's unusual and vexing composition of ether, noting it's unlike anything he's seen, and when discussing La Habrea excising part of his soul, Themis comments, "You nearly rewrote your existence, and that you escaped with your life was nothing short of a miracle." Maiming the soul was recognized as something that would fundamentally alter, if not kill a person. As it was, it still resulted in a personality change that didn't go unnoticed by other members of the Convocation, and La Habrea mentions keeping the crystal housing his severed soul out of fear should something go awry with the remainder of it. Touching back to the Plenty, the decimation of the ancients didn't inherently change the nature of mankind. They continue to seek advancement, pursue a better world, and aim for the best of all futures. This is the motivation of all of the protagonists. As long as mankind does not destroy itself or is destroyed by another force, they will eventually reach the same point as the ancients, where the majority of their suffering has been mitigated. The sundering merely delayed the issue to some point in the future.
Divided over the fate of the star. A rare occurrence, always fleeting. But not this time. Not this time.
The ancients didn't collectively agree on the third sacrifice. Had that been the case, Elidibus would not have withdrawn himself from Zodiark for the purpose of reconciliation. We're given no indication there was an unwillingness to compromise or seek other options, save for one abstracted cutscene from Venat's point of view. Sadly, we never directly see Elidibus's attempts to mediate, since a character with agency cannot be allowed anywhere near Venat. It also seems unlikely the third sacrifice would have taken place while he, as the heart, was absent, and rather it would appear Venat used his departure to her advantage to strike a weakened Zodiark. The discovery on the moon that the souls of the first two sacrifices were intact, retrievable, and existing within a purgatory also shifted the moral calculus of the arguments. It became understandable to view it as imperative to save their souls instead of abandoning them to their fate. It's not reasonable to expect everyone to forge ahead with their lives carrying that knowledge, especially those who had lost loved ones in what was an act of altruism to save civilization from extinction. A fundamental part of their belief system was returning to the star, and their saviors were being denied it.
Supposing it is all true, I must ask myself why I would do what I did. Why would I feel I had no recourse but to oppose the 14 and create this Hydaelyn?
The Warrior of Light told them of the sacrifices because Emmet comments within this same cutscene, to sacrifice oneself for the star is a noble act. At this point, without the context of Medion and her report, Venat does not understand her future self's actions. This is because Venat's objective was never to protect the new life. They were sundered too. It was to prevent the ancients from going down what she considered to be the path of weakness. During the Anamnesis and NieR cutscene, the concern brought up is, should we continue down this path, it will not serve to forestall our doom. They're discussing the fate of mankind, not the lives of the sacrifice. Her objection is ideological, not moral, based on what the sacrifice represents to her, rather than the sacrifice itself. She never speaks of their right to life, nor have the writers tied their defense to her motives. They didn't matter to her, except how they factored into what she viewed as the ancients' downfall. This is the ideology presented and given screen time as being her dilemma in Endwalker. The information we'd initially received about the third sacrifice was from Emet-Selch by proxy in Shadowbringers. The Convocation believed that's what the conflict was about, however, we learned they were misled. This was also alluded to in an interview with Yoshida in August of 2019 with 4Gamer, where he says, "We don't know until we hear Hydaelyn's side of the story." The details of the third sacrifice were far too extensive to get into in this video. Please see the separate one we have planned dedicated to its discussion. Did she propose any alternatives, or were her faction collectively willing to forsake those who'd given their lives so that they may live? Even had people been swayed to her side, what then? How does it solve the issue of Medion? Had mankind suitably passed her test, would they have been rewarded with the truth instead of condemned to obliteration? Does it not settle the debate that sundering everything for the purpose of Dynamis was unnecessary if she wouldn't have done it had they answered her platitudes with the attitude she demanded? Noting Azim also refused to join Venat simply on the basis of countering Zodiark. Venat's hand was not stayed for anyone. She destroyed all, believers in her cause and new life alike. The writer's creating a situation in which she's justified in the massacre of everyone on the star, culpable or otherwise, is a sketchy idea to put into a story. What was her threshold? Had the decision to proceed with the third sacrifice come down to 51 to 49, would she still have gone through with the sundering, even if nearly half of mankind had opposed it? Hydaelyn's summoners were also kept in ignorance. A friendship of record confirmed she withheld the truth and offered precious little of her glimpse into the future. It's worth noting, during the NieR recording, the one reporting back from meeting with the Convocation is not Venat. As Emmett tells us in Elpis, the Convocation does not tolerate acts of deception or malice. We are practiced at perceiving truth, and would have known had Fandaniel lied to us. Venat would have been detected as being deceitful had she ever entreated with the Convocation, so any attempt to do so would not have been in good faith. It would also suggest she never personally engaged with either Elidibus or Azim, which may be why one of her summoners beseeched the latter. The line in the aforementioned short story, "A power such as Zodiark possessed was anathema to the progress of man," shows he'd been made into an ideological straw man. Venat would have been trying to convince traumatized, grief-stricken people why they should allow their family and friends to remain imprisoned inside Zodiark. Particularly egregious is the line about learning from the mistakes of yesterday. We're not shown there was ever an alternative to Zodiark, and at the time he was summoned, the star had been so corrupted the only ether left to use were the ancients themselves. Saying the future must not bear the cost for saving the past sounds great on paper, but isn't practical. It's a pleasant-sounding principle that does nothing to explain why exactly they should be willing to abandon the 75% who sacrificed themselves for their benefit inside Zodiark when they could yet be saved. Noting the new life are the creations of Zodiark that only exist as a result of their sacrifice. Whatever arguments she made were formulated while hiding the truth of the crisis. They cannot know the issue is unresolved unless Venat tells them why it's not. The ancients volunteered under the imminent threat of the star dying, and when you speak to them in Mare Lamentorium, it's clear many are not happy about what happened. Venat told no one of the final days, allowed Zodiark to be created with the lives of the people around her, gathered followers to oppose him instead of Medion, and then fundamentally stole him for her own purposes. Hydaelyn decided their immortal souls would be the perpetual protectors of her children instead, leaving them removed from the ethereal sea indefinitely, a fate worse than death. Her plan was predicated on their non-consensual exploitation, and then she ensured any knowledge of them was erased from history. As an aside, I continue to be baffled at the stance some have taken that the necessary self-sacrifice of the ancients, which is consistently referred to in a positive and admiring light, is more evidence they earned or deserved their fate. The infamous quote, "A single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic," by Joseph Stalin seems appropriate here. We're given only one face to those who offered their lives and immortal souls in heroic self-sacrifice to save the star, and that's Hythlodaeus. The few others we encounter are either the nameless shades on the moon or generic ancient speech behind masks with no meaning to us. This is part of Endwalker's systematic dehumanization of the ancients. It's important to note here that these were people's family, friends, and loves, that their unwillingness to forsake was twisted and used as justification for their demise. Elidibus says, "That is what our people are to us, an irreplaceable existence that can ill be lost. I will save them."
If you would dare to stand against us, to destroy all that we hold dear, then you shall die by my sword.
Thematically, Endwalker runs counter to everything that came before it. I've scattered examples throughout this video to help illustrate the point, lest this section be a montage dedicated to hypocrisy.
You would doom our world to save your own? What would even become of us? Of you?
Following this scene, Alphino says, "Do you think it could be true? that to save their world they must bring ruin to ours. No, it matters not. Such wanton destruction is beyond justification. Whatever their reasons, they must be stopped. The sacrifice, the loss, it ends here. The Warrior of Light and the Scions, who act as the standard of values in the game, have spoken against people in the past who have had similar ideologies and methods to Venat. Their responses weigh heavily in constructing a narrative tone. That they should have no words to or at least about Venat astounded me, especially as 14 has, up until Endwalker, been strictly against the idea that extremist and violent solutions to problems are acceptable, citing the oft-repeated quote from Louisoix, "To ignore the plight of those one might conceivably save is not wisdom, it is indolence." Venat's story stands strangely in contrast to this. When Emet-Selch was chastised in Shadowbringers, it was with the argument that even if his actions created a better future, he didn't have the right to take others' lives for it. The ends didn't justify the means. However, with Venat, those arguments don't exist. Even though she decimated her own people and allowed for the destruction of multiple shards, she is a good person, making the best of a bad situation, who made a difficult but necessary choice. Venat and Emet are two sides of the same coin. One of the reasons why there's so much vitriol surrounding her is because Endwalker took a conflict that had already polarized people and flipped the script, swapping the actors' roles into positions they'd previously opposed, which has created a great deal of cognitive dissonance and retroactive hypocrisy. This is what's known as a broken Aesop, a story where a moral presented doesn't match the original moral the story contained, resulting in the moral feeling tacked on or hypocritical. Endwalker is guilty of breaking quite a few Aesops, but for this section notably, the moral is distorted into it's only wrong if someone else does it, or only if the bad guys do it, and it tries to present a moral ambiguity and fails badly. The avoidance in calling out these contradictions with Hydaelyn, because she was on our side, was a disappointing departure from the nuance of Shadowbringers, since Venat's motives appeared to be similar to the Ascians except in reverse. Many of the arguments that had been applied to the Sundered were used against the Unsundered to justify their destruction without a hint of irony. While Emet and Elidibus were both framed as tragic figures, their flaws and antagonistic elements were still on display, and their wrongdoing was never in question, even if the righteousness of their cause was. The Warrior of Light opposes them, despite understanding their reasoning, but that treatment is not given to Venat, who has more blood on her hands and for less tangible reasons than the Ascians. It isn't until the lore Q&A this is addressed at all, with Yoshida likening Venat to Emet and Hermes, villains in their arcs, and then later by Omega and Beyond the Rift. Why the writers seem comfortable firmly pushing one framing on the Ascians and another on Hydaelyn demonstrates the odd writing surrounding her in general. As mentioned earlier, she exhibits many traits shared by previous antagonists, but in her case they're presented positively. Some of the logic she employs was used by Thordan, such as controlling information, which was considered bad in Heavensward, while the villain who most aligns with her ideology and methods is Ilberd, who thought the Alamegans were weak and ruthlessly sacrificed them en masse for the greater good.
He did not believe the people strong enough to bring about their own deliverance, trusting only in himself. Tyranny seemed to him the only solution.
It's unsettling seeing what's essentially a Thordan-Ilberd hybrid with social Darwinist ideals being both presented by the writers and interpreted by the audience differently due to it being delivered lovingly by a pretty lady, given a fan-favorite track as her theme song, and written with the full gratitude and worship of every notable figure in the story save for Omega. The discomfort isn't helped by the insistence that forced and violent actions aren't necessarily evil if they're committed out of love, which has abusive undertones. Love that we must appreciate and continue to feel good about in ongoing quests, which also render the player choosing not to believe she was justified and Beyond the Rift entirely irrelevant. 14 is also full of situations with people who are unable to accept their present-day circumstances due to a preoccupation with the past. However, in all of those cases, even if they're depicted as being wrong, it's shown change is possible and they're worth saving despite their supposed weaknesses. There's nothing that fundamentally separates the nostalgia of the ancients from that of anyone else. Their condemnation as being doomed in absolute terms, which doesn't apply to any other group as of the Omicron quests, comes across as not only being thematically contradictory, but as awkwardly justifying their demise in such a morally dissonant way it feels deliberately upsetting.
This tragedy, greater even than the seventh umbral calamity, must be undone. If history must be unwritten, let it be unwritten.
The 8th Umbral Calamity timeline is probably the single biggest case of moral dissonance created by Endwalker, due to the abrupt shift to idealist morality over realist, which retroactively taints the entire narrative. This may have been fine in isolation, but they go together like oil and water, which doesn't work when Endwalker is so reliant upon Shadowbringers. It is also a complete failed state for Venat, down to people once again trying to undo the suffering of the present over moving forward in the future, except the Ironworks were uplifted by the writers for it, not decried. This makes the story thematically inconsistent. When the events that occur don't share meaning, what message are we supposed to take from them? Is it foolish and immature to try to reclaim the past, or altruistic and noble? The writing falls apart if the story can't sell the supposed sins of the ancients as something fundamental within its own moral universe. Having the philosophical reasoning behind the extermination of the ancients being contradicted by other parts of the narrative seems not only arbitrary, aside from the mechanical concerns of maintaining the time loop, it begins to feel jarring and cruel. The Ironworks arrived at the conclusion that they lacked the means to restore their shattered world. Their aim was to change the past where the 8th Umbral Calamity never occurred, without understanding the ramifications of altering history, believing it was possible they could be erased from existence. They embraced the same mentality Venat attributed to the ancients, and the Crystal Tower has essentially become the zodiac of the Sundered, having been used twice now to avoid their demise, both at the direct cost of life with Elidibus's sacrifice and the assumed cost of the lives of an entire timeline. The original Final Days was so merciless, the experience of it was permanently seared onto the ether of every ancient soul. It was seemingly the worst thing that has ever happened to anyone, even by current measure. We know of no other events throughout history, calamities and rejoinings included, that have left such an indelible mark. The 8th Umbral Calamity pales by comparison, and yet the Sundered labored for 200 years to devise a means of undoing it. Even if the ancients did want to return to a perfect paradise, it's no different than what the Sundered themselves wanted, other than how the narrative inconsistently treats the two groups. As an aside, I had hoped the return of the Final Days would result in empathy from the Sundered to the Unsundered, only for them to have largely avoided experiencing it, lest we forget the classic line from Arenville's short story, "The final days came and went." Even the Scion's prior sympathy for the Ascians' plight is notably absent in Endwalker. During Shadowbringers, Alisay says regarding Emet-Selch, even if they manage to rejoin all the worlds, they'll never bring back the ones who were lost, but would I have done any different? And Y'shtola later says regarding Elidibus, given what we know, it is plain he will not be deterred from his course, and nor would I were I him, not if it meant forsaking everything I loved. The simplest question to ask in terms of exposing the hypocrisy is, if the position was reversed, and the Scions were the ones facing being sundered, would they accept Hydaelyn's judgment? The answer is no. No, they wouldn't. Emet-Selch is consistently the uncontested favorite character of Final Fantasy XIV. Even within the Final Fantasy franchise as a whole, he's pulled anywhere from 6th to 1st place overall. When the players are meant to like Venat and the goal is the happiest and most uplifting ending possible, where everything is wrapped in a tidy bow and people's beloved characters don't detest one another, they can't feasibly be pit against each other. You'll notice even Hermes and Medion are given sympathy and presented positively along with everyone else in the post-credits artwork, despite being the cause of the final days and responsible for the deaths of trillions. This scene was the culmination of everything associated with Venat and the insecurity of the writing surrounding her feeling disingenuous. It was the cherry on top of the relentless push for the audience to like her, to view her as benevolent, and to believe everyone had good intentions, wanted to save the world, and had all rallied behind you. Everyone was a victim of being used as a mouthpiece to boost Venat, but with Emmet, it felt more egregious because prior to Endwalker, he was such a well-written character, and here, his dialogue comes across as a forced happy resolution. The only rationale for Venat allowing him to escape the Sundering, as stated in the lore Q&A, was to resolve the time loop. Emmet speaking of how she manipulated him into playing his part, as if the whole thing was some light-hearted joke, gave no weight to events, just sentimentality. It was unbelievable, given how deeply Venat had wronged him in particular. Throughout Shadowbringers, the impression we're given is that Emmet considered the Sundering to be essentially a war crime, and he pulls no punches in his condemnation of her. One of the reasons his story is compelling is due to the millennia of hatred and heartbreak he's suffered, which becomes grotesque when you realize it was purposeful. Many have overhyped Emmet's supposed agreement with Venat in this scene when he says, "Our methods would not have brought mankind this far." Extrapolating our methods to mean the ancients as a whole, when Venat herself is an ancient, is spurious. It more sensibly refers to the Asians and the Rejoinings. Admitting a plan is effective at accomplishing its objective isn't the same as endorsement. It also isn't equivalent to stating no other plan would have been viable. The line is, at best, ambiguous and open to interpretation. It's certainly not the affirmation it's been made out to be by the community, and the frequent reliance upon it shows how weak Venat's presented motives were, that people so desperately cling to the belief there was no other successful outcome for the ancients. Said belief also ignores the entirety of the scene following that statement. Emmet explicitly rejects Hydaelyn, and not only expresses no regrets, but doubles down on his values being unshakable. He would still prioritize the survival of the ancients over a resolution at the expense of his people. Emmet's also not omniscient.
Wait! A form of energy other than ether? Dynamis? I've never heard of such a thing.
His memories of Elpis were erased by Kairos, so he didn't remember Dynamis or the role it played, which was one of many plot contrivances in Endwalker. Emmet's initial reaction to Kairos was saying, quite impressive and potentially dangerous. Depending on the intensity of the etheric emissions, Pastorat may wish to have words with you. Noting Pastorat is the convocation seat of discipline and order. Emmet dismissing the gaping hole in his memories, saying I doubt aught of interest occurred, as a sitting member of the governing body and someone dedicated to duty required substantial suspension of disbelief. Hermes as Fandaniel never identified the cause of the final days as being Dynamis related, and Ammon as Fandaniel had no interest in volunteering that information. There's no indication the convocation were even aware the source of it was in outer space, and Amarat, the sound, is described as a keening from beneath the earth, as if the star itself has fallen ill. When the world was sundered, the priority of the unsundered was to restore their people, not solve for a cosmic problem they didn't know existed. The final days had been forestalled by Zodiarch and had shown no signs of returning for over 12,000 years. It seems to bear repeating that Venat never told anyone the truth. The expectation that the Asians, operating in full ignorance and with a saboteur in their midst, should have somehow figured everything out on their own is ludicrous. Xenos also punches a hole, quite literally, into the logic that there was no other way to traverse Ultima Thule and confront Endsinger. Having feasted on ether to become Shinryu, an ether-based primal, to travel to Ultima Thule via said ether, fly directly to Medion's nest, and smash through her ultimatum. His existence alone nullifies any argument there weren't alternatives the ancients could have pursued given the chance. Matter of fact, it could be argued Absolute Horizon was a failed state for Venat, as the Warrior of Light is only able to progress by virtue of ancients and their creation magics, in a place where ether is supposed to avail them not. Perhaps in a misguided attempt to convey a feeling of unity, the plot tries its absolute hardest to make you forget about the inevitable conflict between the Ascians and Hydaelyn. It tries to paint the picture that they were broadly wrong and she was broadly right, but you're never going to see this conflict from the past in full. That would be impossible, because then you would have to confront the numerous layers of gray in the whole situation, and that was simply unthinkable for the sterile portrayals of morality here. In the end, it becomes a simple, dumbed-down tale of general hope versus general despair, and anything deeper than that doesn't matter. Why Venat is polarizing also comes down to the systemic dehumanization of the ancients throughout Endwalker. It was a complete reversal of Shadowbringer's appeal to understanding the ancients as human and relatable. Instead, there was an insistence that they're inhuman and scary based on Yoshida's expectations expressed in a Famitsu interview in March of 2022. This was subsequently used to reinforce the assurance that the sundered version of mankind is superior and deserves to exist more. As I noted earlier, it's the flip side of the Ascian argument without a hint of irony. The question of who is more worthy to live in Shadowbringers was presented as a bad one. The Scion's rebuttal to Emet-Selch was the assertion they wanted to live and had a right to continue doing so. The answer to such a premise should be it's the wrong question to ask, but in Endwalker, the response is framed in the terms of Dynamis and the Plenty. It's dubious because the writers chose to create a scenario in which the only way to save the world was through the extermination of the ancients, who are presented as being beyond salvation and must be eliminated for the greater good. The audience is then encouraged to view it as a necessary evil for the future and growth of mankind, to pave the way for the sundered races, who will be more worthy by contrast. When a story is asking me to be sympathetic to and agree with an action that leads to the mass annihilation of a population, the responsible and ethical thing to do is question and reject it, not accept it. The burden of proof is on the story or its defenders. It doesn't receive a pass because the writers manipulated their cast of characters to try to force that angle. Endwalker played into people's worst impulses, that violence is justified against others due to perceived cultural, societal, moral, and even biological inferiority. It's been disheartening to see how effective this was, especially as it's not difficult to think of real-life historical analogues in terms of the deliberate destruction of a race or culture and using its remnants to build towards something more amiable to those responsible. It's particularly evident when it comes to the aforementioned defense of Venat and the Sundering. Statements such as, "she had no choice, it was the only way," and "she tried to reason with them," are cliches when it comes to apologism techniques for committing atrocities. It's possible to justify anything in your own mind if you truly believe it's doom otherwise. This perception is what's led to unmitigated death throughout history. Cookingway, a creation of Hydaelyn who also believes as she did, blames the victims. However, the ancients did not cause their own downfall. They were not the architects of their own demise. They were sabotaged and assaulted. They didn't deserve what happened to them. That was the tragedy of Shadowbringers, and searching for faults within when they were attacked is appalling. The three Unsundered, who bore witness to and survived, who were the only ones qualified to speak on what the Sundering did, are frequently dismissed. They had no reason to lie, while the Warrior of Light's relationship with Hydaelyn from the beginning was based on dishonesty and deceit, which the Watcher even acknowledges before hand-waving it as being anything of importance. The Sundered were only able to overcome the final days because the Ancients took the hit first. They received the assistance, protection, and accumulated knowledge of the remaining Unsundered, all of which had been purposely withheld from the initial victims. The tendency to dehumanize a group of people, to rationalize a lack of empathy or willingness to help them, especially when it's to our own benefit, isn't unfamiliar. Ideologues like Venat, who think in abstract terms where they don't prioritize the harm their ideals cause others, exist both in the real and sundered world.
I do not want to be a man who sacrifices his friends and family for a cause. I want to fight for Estinian, and I want to save him.
The fact the Warrior of Light is still doing side content in Elpis, knowing innocent people are going to be massacred and doing nothing about it, also speaks volumes. There's no sentiment of the ancients being acknowledged as people who should be saved. They're still to be discarded as necessary fodder. While things could change for them by the end of Pandemonium, it seems unlikely it will be at the impetus of the Warrior of Light, who, as before, will disclose the truth only when pressed, and not due to conscience or creed. As an aside, I have to say Endwalker has done immeasurable damage to my perception of the Warrior of Light as a good person, much less a hero. It becomes particularly uncomfortable when vague generalities are narrowed down into specifics, individual people. The nameless, faceless ancients were doomed to become a dead end. This means your new old friend Hythlodaeus isn't worthy of being saved. He'll selflessly sacrifice himself to save the world, and his reward will be imprisonment within Zodiark for 12,000 years. It means Eric isn't worthy of being saved, and his father, La Habrea, will escape the sundering only to see his son's soul torn apart and his reincarnations die repeatedly throughout the millennia. It means Themis, who trusts the Warrior of Light implicitly and believes they'd never lead him astray, isn't worthy of being saved and must sacrifice himself to become the heart of Zodiark, to toil in vain for the sake of his people, and to ultimately give his soul so that the Warrior of Light can return to the past to apparently continue to not save anyone. Saying these people couldn't or worse shouldn't be saved from what awaits them becomes a staggering claim, and one that is antithetical to the game's messaging up to this point, when the two most repeated quotes throughout the story are to ignore the plight of those one might conceivably save is not wisdom, it is indolence, and for those we can yet save.
We strive to bring swift salvation to this world, that countless lives might be saved, not least your own. Even if it came at the cost of one man, should I have forged on regardless?
While I don't wish to dedicate too much time to Hermes, who has a video of his own, I do feel it's important to note his role in this process. People were hasty to judge the ancients as a whole based on actions that were unexceptional compared to the sundered or real-life humanity. Fixating on their supposed cruelty ignores they tried to be as kind as possible to their creations, particularly in what was essentially an animal testing facility. The sundered have significantly less respect for life, routinely treating lesser life forms as tools to be used for their own ends, sometimes for pure entertainment like the Ul'dah Colosseum. The Sharlayans have their own mimicry of the ancient practice of creating familiars, and Allag was ruthless in its experimentation on all manner of life forms. Criticism of the ancients for this behavior is also immediately undermined by the fact the Warrior of Light is happy to accommodate their requests. The compassion displayed in Elpis was more evidence to me the ancients were caring people. Either the writers didn't think this through very well, the premise is coming from an incredibly sheltered place, or both, since real-life humanity breeds and slaughters billions of relatively intelligent beings every year for largely frivolous purposes. The ancients were kind, compassionate, well-meaning people with their own thoughts, struggles, and individuality. Then the narrative and interviews tried to say everything lovable, charming, and indicative of good-hearted people in a peaceful society were meant to be bad, demonstrative of why they had to be eliminated, and the story is dependent upon people reacting to them that way. Similarly, Venat's actions are depicted as worse than I ever thought possible, while simultaneously urging the audience to view her as noble and benevolent. I think people wanted an easy escape from the uncomfortable idea that their predecessors who unjustly died for them were innocent people. The second Endwalker offered that route, Many people latched onto it, zealously. People generally like characters who are encouraging and affectionate towards their character. It's been a factor with other fan favorites such as Haurchefant, and likely why selling Venat to the audience took the route it did. Many only cared how Venat treated the player, and weren't concerned with how she treated anyone else. Another tactic used to endear the player to Venat was tying her motives to you, which is something else shown to be successful with other characters. Much of the love for G'raha stems from the reveal his driving motivation was you. Likewise, much of the intrigue for Emmet was based on his personal stake regarding you as someone he knew in the past. The writers likely took note of this formula and presumed people would love Venat if she had also been doing everything for them. Within that context, the sundering becomes sort of a touching if tragic gesture which seems to have worked for a lot of people. I can admit, Venat was charming in Elpis, and many of my issues aren't with her, but with the writing. I got the impression I was not meant to analyze her actions critically or view her as morally complicated. The writers decided in advance how they wanted players to think of Hydaelyn and put aside any complexity in the matter. All of the emotions surrounding her is an attempt to get you to feel for her without thinking about any conflict in her character. You're meant to see her as a savior, a maternal figure, and to love her as such. As a player, you're only given one dialogue choice at the beginning of the expansion to express disapproval of her. Once you learn the full story, the Warrior of Light is shoehorned into thinking she's as wonderful as everyone else does. We're clearly intended to view Venat as unambiguously right and good. No character given any credence speaks against her, and her framing is relentlessly favorable and affirming of her perspective. When contrasted with her actions, this creates an uncomfortable dissonance. This is a stark difference from how Grey characters are written, and is not a treatment any other character who is intended to be read as morally complicated gets, such as Ysayle, Regula, Yotsuyu, Emmet, or Elidibus. Venat's statement that the sundering was unjust and unkind, noting she never once expresses guilt or regret in doing so, does not offset the universal zeal in which she's regarded by the characters, player responses, quest log, short story, or minion and codex descriptions, all of which are unabashed in positivity towards her at all occasions. Characters can be biased, but when the game itself is characterizing her thus, it seems evident what I'm seeing is the perspective of the writers, and rather than giving me a choice in what to believe, they're telling me. I may have found her more compelling if she had been left to be what she is, a charismatic yet self-righteous ideologue with a deluge of blood on her hands. I can only assume the writers were worried doing so would leave a bad taste in players' mouths, having been lied to and manipulated for the past 10 years by someone they may have considered a supportive figure to the Warrior of Light. Omega Beyond the Rift is the only time Venat is addressed with any nuance, which hasn't carried over to any other part of the game thus far, least of all the MSQ. Omega points out the irreparable damage she did to mankind, noting the full scale of which is beyond calculation. It is then posited if survival is the deciding factor, then you should also admire Hermes, framing Venat's beliefs and actions as being no different than his. The comparison is extended to include the Omicrons, a race of beings who forced themselves to evolve through ruthless and vicious means. It changed the way we're pushed to understand Venat's position by associating her with others who did horrific things in pursuit of what they believed. As mentioned earlier, the Sage job quests include an antagonist whose explicit aim is to force evolution on his subjects, and the game is clear in presenting this as a villainous act to be opposed. During the Pandemonium quest at Keyward's jail, La Habrea comments in regards to Venat, the previous Asm was much the same, and taking the entirety of the star into consideration, she came to hold dear emotions and people that a more logical mind would have discarded. This made her act in her own self-interest more often than not. This is the most direct acknowledgement we get that Venat was somewhat of a dissident even when acting in an official capacity. While we're in Elpis, Emmet tells us after the meeting with Hermes, it is held that all civil organizations should conduct their affairs with total transparency, and the Convocation is no exception. Later, Hythlodaeus tells us, you needn't be nervous around Venat. Those white robes mark her as one of fair and impartial reasoning. Venat doesn't show she believes society's rules apply to her. She subverts the Convocation, circumvents the institutions intended for debate, and overturns the will of the people in order to enact her own will. I often read Hermes as a tale of the importance of peer review, while Venat similarly violates every procedure, acting in direct opposition to transparency, impartiality, or fairness. Venat lies to everyone, with abandon, to further her own goals. She lied about the origins of Hydaelyn and Zodiark, about how much power she had and what she's capable of accomplishing with that power. She lied by omission, allowing Hermes' false narrative after Kairos to stand. She lied to her own followers, both to mislead the Convocation, the populace at large, and to manipulate them into sacrificing their souls to her. Based on how events unfolded following Elpis, everything she said to the Warrior of Light prior to their departure was a lie, as there's no evidence she tried to mitigate the impact of the final days, or that she ever trusted anyone with the truth. As noted earlier, when addressing her many excuses, she also contradicts herself, switching from many remaining content upon learning of the dead ends to the situation spiraling out of control. Venat as a benevolent force falls apart the moment you have to answer, did she attempt to warn people about Medion? The short story, A Friendship of Record, confirms she didn't even tell her own followers, which is both unethical and disrespectful of their agency. Had they known the cause of the final days, or the consequences of the sundering, they may have felt differently about sacrificing their souls to advance her goals. All they're presented with is an abstracted ideology of not living in the past, with the Zodiark as the boogeyman for hindering mankind's progress.
Genocide has ever been the Empire's favored recourse. And that is why we will continue to oppose your every attempt to claim Eorzea.
The sundering is an effectively genocidal act. In order to feel it was a reasonable solution, it needed to be shown unequivocally there was no other alternative. Otherwise, Venat comes across as monstrous and impossible to sympathize with, even though based on the tone, we're not meant to see her that way, since the writers continue to try to gloss over the moral dissonance with vague positivity. As an aside, Hydaelyn didn't create any of the modern races except for the Loperites. They are either sundered ancients, the new life Zodiark seeded, or alien species. She made mankind only in the sense that someone who slices a cake made the cake. It not only doesn't establish an intrinsic maternal relationship, I would be mortified to discover my soul had been purposely split apart, and skeptical at a minimum of the person responsible. I've never understood why more people weren't bothered by what Venat did to Azim, especially as they're supposed to be the player insert in the unsundered world, and the fact they didn't join her doesn't speak to the veracity of her cause. It also wouldn't be unfair for the Sundered to take issue with what she's done. People are capable of recognizing awful deeds from the past serve to put them where they are now. Venat's level of importance far exceeds any other character in 14, since every decision she made is fundamental to the setting. However, a line was crossed, and the sheer atrocity she committed, the story's apologism of it, and how foundational it is to the lore. Given how deeply tied to everything she is, if you feel dissonant with the perspective the story takes on her, it can be game-breaking. As an antagonistic force, she would have been similar to Emmet, someone who believed their course of action was for the best, no matter the cost. It's how she's already portrayed in the narrative, except unlike Emmet, she faces no backlash. Nearly everything Venat does conflicts with her stated ideals, and as previously mentioned, thematically contradicts everything that preceded Endwalker. There is no indication she tried to explore other alternatives. It appears at the end of Elpis, she's resolved to the Warrior of Light's timeline, with her excuses being a narrative gish gallop. I can no longer view the events surrounding the first as being anything other than proceeding exactly as she wanted. The fact she never revealed the true threat and the purpose behind the sundering to the Ascians casts a shadow over the entire conflict. The Ascians are essentially her controlled opposition. She knew what they would do and paved the way for their existence while they were unknowingly acting as agents of her agenda. Emmett alludes to this in Ultima Thule, which was later confirmed by Yoshida during the Q&A, that Venat had deliberately left an opening for him to escape. This makes Venat undeniably complicit in the rejoinings and her failures by design, especially as there's no evidence she was able or willing to stop them. The Warriors of Light of the Lost Shards may have put up a token resistance, but they needed to fall to bring about the player character on which she'd placed all her hopes. Matter of fact, the calamities align perfectly with her ideology. They are forced resets, often occurring at an apex of mankind. It's not until she's forced to deal with the Medion situation that she starts taking an active role in anything beyond making sure the Warrior of Light doesn't die in order to fulfill the destiny she's created for them. It's in this same Q&A, Yoshida also says Venat working behind the scenes to ensure the time loop is a valid interpretation of events, which I'd argue is the only one that makes sense, because there's no reason to spare Emmett otherwise. The writers decided Venat would keep her memories, likely to form a bond between her and the Warrior of Light. Her becoming aware of the sundered world seemed to cause her to give up on her own, with the promise she made to the Warrior of Light looking like she destroyed her people and made countless billions suffer, all for the sake of one person's existence. I suspect everything coming full circle seemed romantic at the time. Venat wanting to ensure the survival of mankind at any cost, regardless of who's hurt in the process, already makes her controversial, but when you interrogate the specifics of her motives, they fall apart. The only reason she could have to spare Emmett would be if she is determined to recreate the circumstances that lead to the Warrior of Light being sent to the past, despite knowing billions will die to make that happen. This makes any writing suggesting she didn't want the rejoinings to happen incompatible. It's not something we're intended to dwell on, because thinking about it too much undermines the narrative.
From a purely Ascian standpoint, it could be said that what you seek to do is only logical. But that would be to ignore the immeasurable destruction wrought with each rejoining. You have murdered millions, and this we cannot condone.
It would have been easier for her to sunder Emmett and prevent all of the rejoinings. However, if she's dedicated to ensuring the time loop, then any attempt to stop them is counterproductive. This dissonance leaves the player with a vague sense of Venat being dishonest or hypocritical. Furthermore, it feels like the entire scenario surrounding her is nonsense from a mechanical and thematic perspective. You end up with Schrodinger's Venat, simultaneously trying her best to avert the future the Warrior of Light described, while ensuring it comes to pass.
We did everything right! Everything that was asked of us, and still it came to this!
Shadowbringers retroactively is particularly damning, because Venat intentionally aiming for the Warrior of Light's future can be used to explain why she didn't answer the Warriors of Darkness, why she allowed the first to be consumed by light, and why she condemned Ardbert to wander in isolation for 100 years. Menphilia's decisions can only be understood with Venat's foreknowledge. Otherwise, how would she know Ardbert was the Warrior of Light's shard and would be critical to their success? Sparing him without that information serves no purpose.
As the Ascians must serve as instruments of Zodiac's will, so too must others carry out the will of Hydaelyn.
Based on our knowledge, the Warriors of Light she creates have a 100% failure rate. Ardbert and the other Warriors of Light on the first were directly responsible for causing the calamity there, and it's unlikely Hydaelyn wasn't aware of it. We can either presume she chose not to intervene because it needed to happen to result in the player character, or that she's hopelessly incompetent. Nothing in the game supports the latter and insists the opposite. Venat, having no issues with sacrificing lives, whether directly or by proxy, is as text as it can be at this point. Should you find that abhorrent, then you find Venat abhorrent. The Warrior of Light also being partly culpable in this is another issue. Nothing else is applicable if Venat's motive was always to close the time loop. Her judgment of the ancients becomes meaningless if there was never an alternative. Assuming she wasn't trying to intentionally close the loop, then her having this foreknowledge and no hesitancy in putting it to her advantage, only to end up creating the exact same circumstances the Warrior of Light foretold, is ridiculous. The idea that she would not be able to employ any agency in changing events whatsoever from what the Warrior of Light described is incredibly contrived. The Flood of Light in particular could have easily been prevented by giving Ardbert different guidance. Were she trying to change the future, why not behave in ways contrary to what she's been told? She knows she's going to found a group opposed to Zodiark to summon Hydaelyn, and how this all ends in tragedy, but plays into it directly. It's not how someone trying to change the future would act. This excuse is further undermined by Alexander, the only other example of a time loop within the game. Alexander is able to see infinite possibilities, one of which includes preventing the 7th Umbral Calamity by destroying Dalamud. It was Alexander's decision not to change anything because he viewed himself as a threat. Even though he could reshape history for the better, in his case, doing so would consume so much ether it'd inevitably bring ruin to the world. Venat is starting in the past, with knowledge of the future. She doesn't require vast quantities of ether to travel through time and space to make changes like Alexander does. It's a general criticism of Endwalker and 14 in general that it has no established rules of time travel, and just does whatever it needs in the moment to advance a specific plot. All examples of it within the universe contradict each other in one manner or another, and as a result, it's difficult to accept that Venat is somehow bound by a paradox when conflicting evidence exists that shouldn't be the case.
Nothing is impossible. This I have always believed.
Many of the arguments surrounding Venat's actions center on the notion that all other alternatives were impossible. It was impossible to tell anyone the truth, to work with the Convocation, for the Ancients to change, to alter the timeline, or to silence the Song of Oblivion any other way. However, according to her own words, if it could be imagined, it could be done, so none of these would be excuses. Her believing it was the only way doesn't mean it was, which is why the often cited trolley problem was one of her own making and cannot be applied objectively. Her deeds are also antithetical to the rights of freedom and self-determination. She chose the fate of mankind and manipulated individuals into following a path.
The victor shall write the tale, and the vanquished become its villain.
The Warrior of Light is in Elpis because the Source is dying from the final days, and they have no idea what's causing it or how to stop it. Venat placing her hopes on them was choosing an uncertain future, not one in which victory was assured, based on her interaction with someone considered exceptional among the Sundered. She had no idea what was going to happen once the Warrior of Light made it to Ultima Thule, betting everything on mankind finding their own way. Her theories on Dynamis, which she admits she only has a basic understanding of, once again appear to be incorrect. Hydaelyn warns ether will avail you not in a domain formed of Dynamis, yet ether is the only means in which the Warrior of Light can proceed after the failed state of Absolute Horizon. Despite the Scion's resolve, they're systematically unmade, and collectively neither they as Sundered nor Dynamis is sufficient to reach Medion's nest. It takes ancients and ether-based creation magics. Having to rely upon Emmet loving Azim and the Star too much to not play along is also rather sinister, especially in the context of his intentionally being spared with the eventual goal of exploiting those emotional attachments. Not to mention the sheer improbability of Xenos arriving in the final hour to carry the Warrior of Light to victory. When your plan is contingent on Emet-Selch having sex, you need to think of a new plan. While I understand the Loporrits are the token comic relief, they also make Venat look incredibly incompetent. It's played for laughs, but appears horribly amateurish on her part, and like her backup plan was never really a viable alternative. First, there's the obvious dilemma of Medion directing her despair beam at the refugees of Etheirys. Second, escaping to another star was also a gamble. Even if the Loporrits discovered an inhabitable world, the bereaved dragon in Ultima Thule tells us, the richest stars were home to the harshest rulers, and the arrival of the dragons incited contests for supremacy. And Midgardsormr had already scoured the universe, searching for a safe place to bring his eggs, referring to Etheirys as the last bastion of hope. Then there's Smileton, which was to be a paradise for the people of Etheirys, a refuge where every need is met, its inhabitants content and happy for all of their days, because thematic inconsistency is rampant throughout Endwalker. Venat is just another person, no more predisposed to making the right choices than anyone else. When we learn she's Hydaelyn, the most fitting and narratively sincere thing would have been to convey she is flawed and imperfect, no more ascended in thought or ideals than any of her brethren. However, her human aspects aren't explored because she has to be right and good first and foremost. Even as the story tries to demonize the notion of perfection, it presents her as an instance of it, to exaggerated degrees in a friendship of record, with little need to change, to an extent that is not really credible. When the aim behind writing a character is making the audience like them, it rarely leads to great things. And the story desperately wants to sell the audience on seeing her a particular way, regardless of what she does, even if her actions are ones the narrative had thoroughly condemned up until this point. It seemed like the writers weren't sure how to reconcile the character of Venat with that of Hydaelyn, who was already established. So many points were left vague, likely in the hopes people would think about it and just go along with the themes. Keeping the audience from hating her seemed more important than the coherence of the message. What we ended up with was a create-your-own character, where people can focus on different scenes and dialogues to assign their own motivations to her. The result is most people like her, but there's little consistency in interpretation of the thoughts and feelings behind her behavior. Any individual part can be justified with some conjecture, but in aggregate, it collapses under its own weight. Earlier plot points they'd established made it so Hydaelyn destroyed the Unsundered World, which players ended up more captivated by and sympathetic to than the team expected. So if the audience is to love her, she needed a good reason for the sundering, and the writers are contradictory about what that is, between maintaining a timeline, racial attributes, and a dead-end culture that wasn't sufficiently substantiated, while also compromising Shadowbringer's messaging. It might not matter to people who weren't interested in the Unsundered World or its characters, but for those who were, it makes its destruction and consequences feel arbitrary and meaningless. Storytelling and execution can unintentionally put forth troubling messages through carelessness. Somewhere along the way, in attempting to tie all these threads together with the existing plot, they accidentally wrote a social Darwinist ideologue with genocide apologism that encouraged the dehumanization of the ancients, which appears to have hit them belatedly judging by the Q&A, where Yoshida wanted to communicate that Hydaelyn's not a bad guy. I'd also like to note that in avoiding the supposed trope of making Venat an anti-villain, Endwalker is littered with other more egregious tropes to compensate for their subversion of expectations, not just broken Aesops. The writing choices surrounding Venat and most of Endwalker are inscrutable. There are numerous details that could have been changed to absolve her of guilt without needing drastic rewrites, but instead they opted to portray her as deliberately orchestrating events, despite most of them being actively harmful to others. The issue isn't merely an absence of facts, but the presence of facts that counter the premise, which require audience dismissal. It begs the question why the writers left so many openings for her to be interpreted as not being a good person, especially as she's so intricately woven within the fabric of the lore and setting. You can't ignore her or her ideals going forward. The narrative's strange moral compass has now become distracting, particularly when the so-called epilogue of the Omicron quests shows forgiveness, understanding, and salvation for the dead ends, and still nothing for the ancients, for whom that fate was only a distant possibility. No catharsis is offered for those who felt their tragedy was unjust. It would seem the writers, much like Venat, were so intent on getting rid of the ancients, they were willing to sacrifice everything in the world building to do it. Another factor in what makes people upset is they feel their warrior of light is complicit in what happened. Despite being affected by the ancients and their struggle, the warrior of light never questions the person who ended them. And it's difficult to believe they would only nod and smile at a person who has done so much harm and never answered for any of it, no matter how noble her intentions were. The discomfort many have described is due to feeling railroaded into agreeing with Venat that the massacre of the ancients was necessary and not putting forth any effort to try to save them despite being granted continuous opportunities. This is not helped by Endwalker following a time travel parallel in Shadowbringers, where history was rewritten at the potential risk of an entire timeline to save just one person. Venat and her decisions can be judged on their own merit, but when the game is telling the player your avatar is content to leave the ancients to their fate, it becomes a problem. This is why there's a clamoring for an alternate timeline, even if there's never any interaction with it. The existence of it would establish that the Warrior of Light isn't complicit and wanted to help the ancients instead of shrugging aside their deaths while still accepting quests from them. Per an interview with Twinfinite in August of 2019, Yoshida said Ishikawa wished to humanize the Ascians and Emet-Selch and to explore them as characters instead of leaving their vision unclear. I can only speculate where the cracks formed, with Ishikawa having free rein with Shadowbringers to subvert the preconceived notions of the prior story installments without accounting or planning for what would follow. Perhaps Yoshida and or other writers were inflexible or oblivious to what was happening and were unwilling to bend to the new story direction the audiences loved when it veered from their overall vision. Endwalker certainly felt like a hard course correction, especially following another statement of Ishikawa's in a September 2019 interview with VG247, where she said, "With the narrative of Shadowbringers, we focused on why so many people associate everything moral and virtuous with light. To some people, what may seem like the right of way or what's true or good for them might not necessarily be good for everyone. We had the concept of turning the light versus darkness motif on its head because we wanted players to consider how critical perspective is. Players have already seen how Eorzea's people view light as everything that is good. However, light is the mark of evil in Norvrant. The general impression I've gotten from reading interviews is that Ishikawa thinks of the story as a subjective piece, where no one is really right or wrong, while Yoshida sees it as more of a straightforward heroic fantasy. Comparing developer commentary between Shadowbringers and Endwalker would make you think two entirely different teams worked on them, because the storytelling philosophies expressed are so divergent. It's difficult to know who exactly is responsible for what components of Endwalker, but considering the material Ishikawa is confirmed to have written post 6.0, such as Omega Beyond the Rift and the NieR Reincarnation crossover, along with her being the one pushing Grey for Hydaelyn to begin with, I'm not inclined to lay all the blame for Venat's characterization at her feet. I also doubt it was a coincidence Venat's namesake is an antagonist from Final Fantasy XII. However, we'll probably never know the details of what happened and what seems to have been a crowded writer's room. It feels like some of the writers are still dying on hills for their take on the story without considering how it impacts the broader picture. I saw it best described as listening to two different songs being played at the same time. In isolation both are fine, but as one melody it's discordant. What the team was aiming for seemed to be an inspiring, encouraging story of everyone past and present, regardless of alignment, joining hands and uniting in purpose to save the star. More importantly, they all believe in and support you. You can see the potential of Venat loving the Warrior of Light's experiences and journey so much that she makes the decision to affirm it and ensure it happens as something well-meaning and intended to be validating. I don't doubt that Endwalker had sincere intentions in uplifting the player, but as a result of the expansion being rushed, ill-planned, with Hydaelyn tunnel vision, and seemingly a goal to course-correct everything that made Shadowbringers compelling, they did it in a way that presumed the player was a self-centered, self-serving person. The story also threw everything it possibly could at the way it portrayed the Sundering to soften Venat's actions, which were explicitly intended to annihilate an entire race of people by dehumanizing her victims, then using abstraction techniques to obscure the violence and identity violation she inflicted. The previous expansion's emotional impact depended upon understanding the victims of the Sundering were people and empathizing with them as such. So if your perspective is centered around those Venat harmed, then everything immediately becomes a horror show. It's also a matter of value judgments. If you value loyalty, honesty, and believe the quality of life is worth more than the mere existence of life, you probably won't sympathize with Venat. You can believe in moral complexity and still believe Venat was wrong if you consider her actions to be antithetical to your own moral framework. The obvious issue with this is it makes those players feel like they're no longer on the same page ethically as the writers. Storylines going forward are either going to return to the values of everything prior, where Endwalker becomes a strangely hypocritical outlier, or they're going to continue pushing a value system where those same people not only can't relate to their character and companions, they're also going to feel they're not good people in what's supposed to be a heroic fantasy. Dialogue options since 6.0 have also not been subtle about forcing a perspective through limited choices, which is only going to create further dissonance. When you have to ask, how do we justify this genocide, frankly, you're already headed the wrong direction as far as storytelling goes. Putting that aside, the more controversial a plot element, the tighter the plot has to be to get people to accept it in good faith, and genocide was the right choice to save the world is about as controversial as it gets. Word of God communicating Hydaelyn's not a bad guy, demanding you ignore the inconvenient details, doesn't work for those who can't just roll with the vibes of intent. I've seen it said the level of anger directed at Venat far exceeds any other character in 14, because her level of importance to the story far exceeds any other character in 14. Every decision she made is foundational to the entirety of the lore and world building. Is genocide is always wrong, and Venat committed genocide, therefore Venat was wrong, that difficult a concession to make? Apparently so, because Yoshida now parades around in a jacket that celebrates Hydaelyn and glorifies a crime against mankind, showing they either don't get it or don't care. Bad news for those who felt the messaging that came out of the writing surrounding her, even if unintentional, was deeply unsettling and grossly unethical. Venat failed because she was too transparent in both the admiration the writers had for her and her role as a fix for the previously established story. She's whatever she needs to be at the moment, oscillating between whatever makes you like her and making the plot work somehow. Rather than a nuanced anti-villain, they decided to double down on the affection, possibly out of concern a betrayal would be too dark. The only change needed to achieve this is that Hydaelyn tempers, and Endwalker instantly makes perfect sense. Venat is a mix of fear of experimentation and desire to finish everything with their favorite character, and to such an extent, I could argue Final Fantasy XIV is now Venat's story, and the Warrior of Light is merely the vehicle through which it's told.
That concludes today's lesson on long-forgotten history. Though I imagine your mother would offer a rather contradictory account. as is her wont.